Good morning and welcome back to the World History course. I am Professor Philippe Girard. You're all aspiring historians, so you should be pretty good at picking up on little clues to get a sense of the historical context, right? So in the last video, you probably noticed that your professor had a beard, that he was all red and sweaty for lack of AC, that he had roofing material in the room, that his shirt was wrinkly, and that the leaves outside were pale green and brand new. What could that mean? Think about it. Oh, I know. That means he was recovering from a hurricane. That's right. Well, today your professor looks less like a caveman, so you might guess that he got the electricity back. And you'd be right. Though I still don't have internet yet, so I'm not sure when I will be able to upload those videos, hopefully before the semester is over. But then if you can watch this video, that means that my internet is back and that all is well again. At any rate, let's leave the awfulness of 2020 behind us and take a big step back 1,000 years into the past. In this section, we've been exploring Europe and the Middle East during the Middle Ages. Among other things, I explained that the downfall of the western part of the Roman Empire led to a period of chaos known as the Lower Middle Ages or the Dark Ages. During that period, from roughly 500 to 1000 AD, lawlessness prevailed, the economy contracted, and the population shrank. Hence, the term Dark Ages. In Western Europe, at least. I also noted that the Byzantines and the Arab empires, they were far more advanced at the time. Well, today we're going to pick up the story from here and cover what came next in Western Europe, a period of revival known as the High Middle Ages, that lasted from roughly 1000 AD to 1300 AD. Our main focus will be on northern France because I'm French. That's why. I can't come up with an explanation. Let's start with politics. As you may remember from the lecture on the Dark Ages, when Rome fell, the Roman province of Gaul, France today, that was taken over by a Germanic tribe, the Franks, who established their own kingdom, and that's why it's called France today. That Frankish kingdom was first ruled by the Merovingian dynasty, the one of King Clovis, then the Carolingian dynasty, the one of Emperor Charlemagne, and in both cases, those dynasties did not enforce primogeniture, i.e. all the sons of a deceased king could claim a share of the kingdom, which led to endless civil wars and dynastic dispute. The next French dynasty, the Capetians, took over in 987. Various branches of that family would rule France until the era of the French Revolution, 800 years later. So clearly they got something right if they lasted so long. Well, what made the Capetian dynasty so enduring is that, well, one, they were generally able to produce a male heir for the next generation. And two, they were the French dynasty, the first one, to enforce primogeniture. The eldest son got everything. And that might not seem fair, but this way the kingdom would not be split anytime a king died. And the kingdom of France wasn't that big in 987. Early Capetian kings, they only controlled Paris and its immediate vicinity, the Île-de-France. The French king, he might wear a crown, but he was not especially powerful. When I covered the Vikings, I told you how the Duke of Normandy, William, who was officially the inferior of the King of France, as the Duke, he controlled a much richer province than his king, Normandy, and eventually all of England as well. But bit by bit, by keeping their inheritance together, those Capetian kings were able to expand the royal kingdom, either through war or by marrying well-endowed ladies. I mean, that's in terms of their dowry, of course. And then after that, after a few centuries, those kings of France would control all of what is France today. Beyond primogeniture, the other innovation of the Capetian era was feudalism. And when we use the term feudal today, it has a negative connotation. It means old-fashioned, antiquated, barbaric. But feudalism was something more specific back then. It was a political system that brought a modicum of stability to Europe around 1000, and so it's worth studying in some detail. So here was the initial problem for French kings like the Capetians. They had valid claims to various territories in France, but they struggled to defend those lands because those kings lacked the funds to finance a standing army on a permanent basis. Meanwhile, there were a lot of young men with military training who were all too willing to fight and stir trouble everywhere. Well, the feudal system solved that conundrum in a brilliantly simple way. Kings simply co-opted all of those young troublemakers and hired them as their underlings. So the French kings, who were known as the lords in the feudal system, would enter into a contract with a military person who was known as the vassal, whereby the lord would grant his vassal a piece of land, which was called a fief in Old French, in exchange for military service. Something like that. Here's 10,000 acres of land. In exchange, you owe me 20 nines for 1 month of campaigning each year. Sign on the dotted line. And that was a genius idea. This way the king could use what he had plenty of, and that was land, to get what he really needed, and that was soldiers to defend that land. Note that this piece of land was not permanent. Technically, the fief, the land that still belonged to the king, was simply loaned it to his vassal in exchange for ongoing military services year by year. So the fief, the land, that could be taken back if the vassal did not perform as expected. In practice, though, these contracts usually lasted for the entirety of the life of a vassal and even beyond. It was pretty common for a lord to hire the son of the vassal after the vassal passed away, though the lord expected a payment for that privilege, which is the ancestor of the inheritance tax today. Obviously, that system only worked if both sides held to their part of the bargain. If a vassal used the income from the fief to raise an army to fight against his lord, then the whole system broke down. So the contract between lord and vassal was sealed in a formal ceremony known as homage. The vassal, he would publicly pledge his loyalty to his lord. He would pay homage, which is where we get that expression, and preferably would do so by swearing on a Bible or holy relics, all that in front of a priest. To recant, which is to break your oath, that was a grave sin in the Middle Ages because that meant lying to God himself. So a vassal, like say the Duke of Normandy, he could then parcel out his own lands, his fief, further to lesser counts and earls, using the same feudal contract system, and those lesser vassals could do the same in turn all the way down to the local petty lord. So the feudal system was like a pyramid of interlocking relationships. That was in no way egalitarian because, well, democracy in France was still 800 years away, but at least that kept some amount of order because if everyone did as expected, the vassal had lands to exploit and then the lord had loyal knights to defend him. So that diminished the likelihood of a war. Think of Confucianism in China, which we studied in the previous section. Confucius, he also lived in troubled times, and his solution was also to create a strict hierarchy where everybody knew their place and where honor and loyalty were key. There could be an issue, though, when a vassal pledged his loyalty to various lords to get multiple plots of land, and then those lords went to war with each other. On which side was the vassal supposed to fight then? Well, some lords fixed that issue by insisting on a kind of super homage known as liege homage that superseded all competing claims. So when you're saying to your friend, my liege, in an ironic way, you're actually referring to the feudal system of yore. And you're saying that your loyalty to your friend is more important than your loyalty to any other friend. Remember that. If you're interested in learning more about the feudal system, I recommend reading the book Feudal Society by a personal hero of mine, the French historian Marc Bloch. It's an old book, but it's really insightful. So feudalism consisted in contracts between lords and vassals, land against military service. But there was also a second category of contracts that was done more at the local level between the petty lords and their peasants. And here was the conundrum in their case. The petty lord, he needed income to finance his knights because steel armor and war steeds, they were very expensive. And the lord had no intention of actually working with his hands to make a living because he was a noble. Meanwhile, the peasants, they needed protection in dangerous times and they had no military training to do so. So the solution was, you guessed it, another contract. This time the local lord would promise to protect the peasants and welcome them, as well as the cattle, inside his castle in case marauders attacked them, and in exchange, the lord expected payment from his peasants. Some of that came in cash, Peasants had to pay a bewildering array of fees whenever they used the Lord's mill or his bridge or what have you, but mostly they paid in labor. They farmed the land of their Lord in addition to their own, and whatever crop was grown on those lands, that would go to the Lord. So kind of a protection racket, if you ask me. At this point, you're thinking, well, is that slavery then? After all, those peasants, they were required to work for free on the Lord's land or suffer the consequences. And you'd be partly right. These peasants were known as serfs, a term whose etymology goes back all the way to a Latin word for slave. Those serfs, they were tied to the land, so they couldn't just pack up and leave to some other place if they wished. And whenever a king leased out a fief to a vassal, he gave over not just the land, but the people who lived on it. But medieval people, they did not view serfs as slaves. There were actual slaves in the Middle Ages who were bought and sold like chattel. And then there were serfs who were a step above because they worked part of the year on their own lands as free people. And then there were free people, another category, who worked entirely on their own account, though they still had to pay taxes to local authorities, just like any taxpayer today. So different categories. Freedom was more the norm in cities because these cities occasionally bought back all their obligations under feudal contracts so that they could no longer owe anything to a lord. And you can see that in their name. If you travel through Europe today, you'll see a lot of towns that are named Freiburg in Germany or Villefranche in France. And that means that this was a free town in the Middle Ages, free of feudal dues. So those two feudal contracts, lord and vassal, and then petty lords and local serfs, they were supposed to be a one-time contract between two parties, but in practice they remained in place generation after generation, and then they hardened into social classes like the caste system of India that we studied earlier. In medieval Europe, there were three social classes, or estates as they were called. And these classes were not equal. Each had a role to play in society, which is called an organic or corporatist vision of society, where each class is like an organ of the human body with a specific function to perform. So the first estate was the clergy, the church, priests, nuns, the like. The role of the clergy was obviously religious, to celebrate Mass, to administer sacraments, to keep records of baptism, etc. And the clergy also played a cultural role since monasteries were centers of learning and universities often began as church schools. The church, the clergy, normally did not do physical labor. Their income came from a tax, the tithes, charitable donations, or income from the vast lands that the church owned. The second estate was the nobility, and these would be the kings, the dukes, the knights, etc. Their role was to fight and to govern. So how did you become a noble, you might ask? Well, by birth. You were a noble because your mom and your dad were nobles. Which begs the question, well, how did one's ancestors become nobles in the first place? I mean, there must have been someone at some point in history who first told others, I'm a noble and I'm better than you are, all of you, and others were stupid enough to agree, and every descendant was a noble after that. And there's a great bit on this in the Monty Python movie Holy Grail, where a peasant woman questions what's so special about King Arthur that he should be king and not her. Actually, let's watch that for a sec.
I order you to be quiet!
Order? Who does he think he is?
I'm your king.
Well, I didn't vote for you.
You don't vote for kings.
Well, how'd you become king then?
The Lady of the Lake, her arm clad in the purest shimmering samite, held aloft Excalibur from the bosom of the water, signifying by divine providence that I, Arthur, was to carry Excalibur. That is why I'm your king.
Listen, strange women lying in ponds distributing swords is no basis for a system of government. Supreme executive power derives from a mandate from the masses, not from some farcical aquatic ceremony.
Be quiet!
Oh, but you can't expect to wield supreme executive power just because some watery tart threw a sword at you.
Shut up!
Oh, but if I went round saying I was an emperor, just because some moistened bint had lobbed a scimitar at me, they'd put me away.
Shut up! Will you shut up?
Ah, now we see the violence inherent in the system.
Shut up!
Oh, come and see the violence inherent in the system. Help, help, I'm being repressed.
Bloody peasant!
Oh, what a giveaway. Did you hear that? Did you hear that, eh?
In case you haven't noticed, I'm a descendant of French serfs, so I'm always dubious about the claims by nobles that their blood is innately superior to mine or my family's. Bunch of inbred profiteers, if you ask me. Just look at the Habsburg line of kings if you don't believe me. Anyways, because nobles intermarried generation after generation, they eventually came to think of themselves as a different group from the rest of the population. They even used the term race when that word first appeared. And nobles were different in many ways. Nobles didn't do manual labor like serfs. That was beneath them. They didn't entertain themselves like you and I. They liked jousting and hunting, two occupations that were in keeping with their warrior status. If a serf hunted, on the other hand, that was called poaching, and that was severely punished. Even the nobles' diet was different. Nobles preferred to eat prestigious game that they had killed in a hunt, like bulls and stags, or anything that flew up in the sky, like ducks. But animals that burrowed into the ground, like rabbits, they were inferior because they came from below. And the same thing with fruits and vegetables. Something growing up in the air, such as apples and peaches, that would be noble food. If it grew into the ground, like carrots and turnips, that was peasant food. Notice how the worldview was structured vertically. Nobles ate what was physically high, above ground, and similarly they built their castles on top of hills, not just for military reasons, but also to showcase their elevated social status. Think of it next time you pick your fruits and vegetables at the grocery store. Did it come from a tree or from the ground? And if you're a social climber, pick what came from up high. And obviously don't pick corn or tomatoes or potatoes because, well, they didn't exist in medieval Europe until Columbus brought those crops from the Americas after 1492. Beyond the clergy and the nobility, the first two estates, the rest of society, the commoners, they did not really have a name, so by default it was called the third estate, whoever was not a noble or a priest. That estate represented the vast bulk of European society, from merchants and tradesmen in the cities all the way to serfs in the countryside. But farmers, mostly, because most people were farmers. Their main task, that was to pay taxes and to work hard. Obey orders and don't think too much. That's it. To use the metaphor of an organic society, if the clergy was the head, thinking, and nobility was the heart, fighting and leading, commoners, they were the hands of society, working and obeying. The legal status of serfs improved over the years, but basically the three estates system remained the norm until the French Revolution instituted legal equality for all citizens of France in 1789. Hooray for that. Feudal society, however unequal, that brought some level of stability to Western Europe because it made war less common, or at least more predictable. And that led to a period of revival known as the High Middle Ages. High as in superior, not drugged out of their mind. Better times, they were also made possible by improvements in agriculture. And I know that studying the technology of plowshares is not exactly sexy. It's not as exciting as figuring out how William the Conqueror won the Battle of Hastings, for example. But the vast bulk of the European population worked as farmers, often just one bad crop away from famine. So even small improvements in farming techniques made a huge difference for the people. And there were some notable improvements in the High Middle Ages. The first pertained to the horse harness. Horses had been used before that, of course, but the harness that was in used before was more like a collar. So whenever a horse pulled hard on a plow, it would push on its windpipe and strangle it. So people had to use horses at a fraction of their true pulling capacity. And things changed when a new horse harness was devised that pushed on the horse's chest, not the neck, and that finally allowed those horses to use their full strength when pulling a carriage or a plow, which is why a standard unit of energy for vehicles today that is called a horsepower. And by the way, new horse harnesses that also impacted the field of warfare. Again, ancient Romans and Greeks, they knew horses, but they didn't know how to ride them in a way that was stable, pun intended. So they couldn't really fight on horseback. Instead, ancient armies used heavy infantry like hoplites or legionaries for actual combat, and they used cavalry for light stuff like reconnaissance. And that changed with the introduction of better saddles and stirrups in the Middle Ages, which for the first time allowed a warrior to use a horse as a stable fighting platform, and which is how mounted knights became the staple of medieval armies. But back to peasants. Until the advent of modern synthetic fertilizers in the 20th century, farmers could not use the same land year after year because that would exhaust the soil. So instead, peasants let their fields go fallow, rest, every other year to give the soil a chance to restore its nutrients. And that meant that half the land capital was unused any given year, which was really wasteful. Until peasants developed the 3-crop rotation system. One year, they would plant a crop like wheat or barley. Then one year, they would plant beans or turnips or any crop that used different nutrients or even replenished the soil with nitrogen. And then one year, they would let the earth go fallow. So with this system, the land use went up from 50% to 66%. And that may not sound like much, but it could be the difference between life and death when crop yields were so low. Another issue for farmers was how to till the soils of northern Europe. They're much richer than those around the Mediterranean Sea, but they're also wet and heavy and hard to work. So the light wooden plow of ancient times that could only scratch the surface of northern fields. Until medieval farmers developed a new kind of heavy plow made of steel that was powerful enough to overturn the heavy northern European soil. That heavy plow was pretty hard to maneuver, so fields were designed as long strips rather than small squares. This way you'd plow with your horse for a long distance until it was time for the horse to rest, and then you would turn around. For that reason, medieval fields were large, open fields with very few hedges and fences, even if they belonged to different farmers. Those fields were more like a patchwork of long strips, each of which belonged to a peasant or the lord, but then they were farmed communally. And anyway, the steel plow was pretty expensive, so it was owned by the community and shared, which fit with that open field system. So you can really read the society of the time in its landscape, whether it's the field or the location of the castle. I find that fascinating. Again, none of that is very sexy, but improvements in agriculture that led to a population boom, which gave Europe the resources to finance overseas expeditions like the Crusades, for example, and we'll get to that when we cap off the section. A growing population that also meant that more people were able to do things beyond farming, such as arts and culture. The wars against Muslims during the Crusades actually helped in that regard because Muslims had access to Greek classics like Aristotle through their contact with the Byzantines. So people like Averroes, a Muslim scholar in Spain, reintroduced Aristotle into Europe, where Aristotle became the major authority on every topic during the High Middle Ages. Obviously, Aristotle was a pagan author. He lived in Greece long before Christ. So he tried to find truth by using human logic, not divine revelation. So that created a bit of a quandary for medieval scholars. Who should they trust? The Bible, which was based on faith and blind acceptance of the divine message, or Aristotle, who used scientific observation of the secular world around him? And that question was at the heart of medieval scholarship, which often consisted of a dialectic, a dialogue between two opposing viewpoints, one based on faith, the Bible, and one on reason, Aristotle, before trying to find a synthesis of the two. A master of that technique was Saint Thomas Aquinas, who attempted in his massive Summa Theologica to reconcile the Bible and Aristotle, to prove that what was taught by God was also in keeping with what was taught by science. In a way, that debate is still ongoing. If you're a devout Christian who's ever wondered how come Genesis tells me that the world was created in 6 days by God, and then Darwin proved otherwise, well, if you're trying to reconcile faith and reason when it comes to evolution, you're walking in the footsteps of Thomas Aquinas. Medieval scholars, they had a new outlet for such debates, and that's universities. The oldest universities in Europe, they appeared during that period that we're studying today, 1000 to 1380 roughly. Whether it's in Bologna, Italy, Montpellier and the Sorbonne in Paris in France, or Oxford and Cambridge in England. But if you have a mental image of a modern university with a set curriculum, a registrar, a rec center, don't let it fool you. Medieval university was a much looser institution where young pupils would attach themselves to a star scholar and learn directly from him, usually orally, because books were insanely expensive, even more than the present-day racket known as college textbooks. Remember that books were still copied by hand, often on vellum, which is animal skin. So a scholar would read a book, and then the students would memorize it because they couldn't afford to buy their own copy. Those students, they were typically young men, which is why the university degree became known as a bachelor's degree. And those students were also pretty rough. They were known for getting into fistfights and brawls all over town. In Paris, they lived specifically in an area of the left bank that became known as the Latin Quarter because, well, that's what students spoke, Latin. And that's still the location of many universities today. And I know it because, well, that's where I did my undergraduate degree, nearby. Though Latin, thankfully, is no longer the norm. I did my studies in French. Speaking of bad boys and superstar scholars, here is my favorite medieval thinker, Pierre Abélard. He was a university professor in Paris. He dabbled in the usual scholastic debates, faith versus reason, but because he was short on cash, he also agreed to tutor the young lady of the house where he lived, so that he would basically cover the rent. Her name was Héloïse d'Argenteuil. She was super smart too, and one of the few women of her time to have access to a top-notch education. I think you know where this is going. The two developed a romantic relationship, and actually one of the most famous couples in all of literature, like Romeo and Juliet or Tristan and Isolde, only they're real. To be fair, the relationship had its quirks. For one thing, she was a teenager and he was much, much older. Also, he was her teacher, so I'm not sure about the ethics of the thing, especially since as a university professor, he had a status akin to that of a priest at the time. And by the way, he would beat her up too. Like physically beat her up, though apparently she was into S&M. People in the Middle Ages, they could be kinky too. And they even had a kid together, out of wedlock, of course. At any rate, the legal guardian of Héloïse, he learned about the affair, he wasn't pleased, and he hired a crew of goons to castrate Abélard. Ouch. And after that, Abélard, he lost his appetite for romance, understandably, and he became an actual bona fide monk, and he moved away from Paris. Poor Héloïse, she was forced to become a nun too, though she remained in love and her sexual appetites were intact, so she wrote a series of famous letters to her ex-lover, who was now living in a faraway monastery, and these letters have remained a classic of unrequited epistolary love. If you want to learn more about them, check out my Women's History radio show, which is on another playlist of this YouTube channel, because I did a show on Héloïse of Argenteuil. Fascinating lady. And also, while you're at it, watch the shows on Eleanor of Aquitaine and Joan of Arc, because these are two other incredible women from roughly the same place and time period. Notice that intellectual life operated on two levels. You have the serious religious scholarship embodied by Abélard, and then the more romantic, even ribald literature pertaining to his love life. And that was true of Europe as a whole, where literary tastes changed a lot in the High Middle Ages. Earlier, the most famous literary works were the Song of Roland in France, Beowulf, or the Nibelungenlied, epic tales of warriors who did little beyond slaying enemies and dragons. But by the High Middle Ages, the public was more sophisticated and expected more fully developed characters with a heart, and that gave rise to romance literature, with works like the Arthurian legends, whose heroes were knights fighting for the Holy Grail, but also lovers who pursued Queen Guinevere. And that is called courtly love, the notion that knights should not just be fighters, but lovers as well. Sophisticated people willing to spend years pursuing a lady because they loved her, not because they wished to bed her. And in fact, the object of their affection was often a married lady of higher ranks, like Guinevere, and so she was unattainable by definition. Troubadours, who were singers and poets in southern France, they were masters of that courtly love. Notice the term courtly love. That was a kind of love that would happen in court, among nobles willing to extend courtesies while courting a woman. And that language of love was yet another way for nobles to differentiate themselves from peasants, because they were viewed as animals when it came to sex. Also notice the word romance literature. Romance meant that it was written in a Latin-based language, like French, but the term eventually gave us Romantic because that literature often dealt with love. The cultural revival of the High Middle Ages, that was also noticeable in architecture. Castles which had been drab affairs made of wood in the Dark Ages, think of moat and bailey castles, that now became impressive, sophisticated structures made of stone. And meanwhile, towns competed to build even more impressive churches. When we studied the Byzantines recently, I mentioned the Roman arch, which was a way to redistribute the weight of the stone roof onto the outside walls so as to build large internal spaces. That Roman technique that flourished in 11th century Europe when a flurry of Romanesque style churches sprang up all over Europe due to rising income levels. Romanesque in that case would be based on the Roman arch. That's nothing to do with being romantic. Well, those Romanesque churches are fairly easy to identify when you travel to European towns. I'll give you one illustration, and that would be the Abbaye aux Dames, a convent built in Caen by William the Conqueror. And notice the entrance and the windows, they're all built using the classical half-circle shape of the Roman arch. And when discussing the Hagia Sophia in Byzantium, I mentioned that the main weakness of that Roman arch is that it exerts a strong outward pressure on the outside walls. And so as churches got bigger in the High Middle Ages, walls had to be made thicker, otherwise they would collapse outward. Notice on that photo that architects filled the windows with stones after the fact, clearly because the walls were not strong enough, and they also added ugly pillars outside to make the building structurally sound. So Romanesque churches, they tended to be fairly small, squat, and dark. All that changed in the 12th century when a French abbot rebuilt the Basilica of Saint-Denis just north of Paris. And that church is famous because it houses the remains of the kings of France. But it's also famous as the first example of a new style of architecture, and that would be Gothic architecture. So look at this picture of the Cathedral of Notre Dame in Paris. Pause the video for a sec and ask yourself what's the difference between this kind of church built from the 1200s, the 1400s, and the earlier church that we looked at that dated from the 11th century. Think about that. One and the other. The easiest way to identify a church as Gothic is to look at the entrance and the windows. They all feature pointed arches instead of rounded. And that pointy shape, that would help redirect the force vectors, kind of the weight from the roof above, more vertically, and thus would lessen the outward push on the walls, which means that you could build high and wide and still use thinner walls that would be pierced by numerous windows, especially if you use flying buttresses, which were outside structures that helped maintain the walls in place. And those architectural tricks that would lead to cavernous interiors seemingly held aloft by a miracle and filled with light since, well, now the walls were much thinner. Well, until some fire breaks out and the whole roof collapses, as happened at Notre Dame recently. That really broke my heart. The first Gothic church was built at Saint-Denis, a town just north of Paris, the Basilica where most French kings are buried. But after that, cathedrals were built using the new system all over northern France, Belgium, and southern Germany from the 12th to the 13th centuries, as cities grew richer and competed for bragging rights. Those cathedrals finally challenged the record held by the Great Pyramids of Giza as the tallest structure in the world, and then they held that record until the advent of skyscrapers in the 19th and 20th centuries. And those modern structures, they were able to soar even higher by using completely different materials altogether. No stone, no wood. Instead, you have either a steel structure, as was the case of the World Trade Center, until it too went down tragically in a fire caused by terrorism, or reinforced concrete, which led to the many big box buildings of 20th century modernism, like the Cité Radieuse of the French architect Le Corbusier. I'm not a big fan of those. I'll take a Romanesque or a Gothic church over a brutalist monstrosity any day. So, pop quiz. Which one of these is Romanesque and which one is Gothic? Think about it. It should be fairly easy. One has rounded windows, thick walls, must be Romanesque, right? The other is vast, with large windows, pointy arches, flying buttresses, gotta be Gothic. And if that was not obvious to you, I would say rewind the video for 5 minutes and listen to this part of the lecture again. There will actually be a question about that in the quiz for the course. Well, the church itself underwent some important reform in the 11th century. In my church, I mean the Catholic Church. There were no Protestants yet in Western Europe until the 1500s. And those reforms were known as the Gregorian reforms after Pope Gregory VII. His main concern was to purify the church, to make it more spiritual. And to be fair, many priests until then were not role models. They took on the job to make money, often from their dads, since many priests were married at the time, and those priests often knew little about their faith. Many priests didn't know Latin. Many couldn't even read anyway. And many didn't even know the Bible because, well, those Bibles were so expensive. In fact, many medieval churches were covered with murals and statues because the priest and his parishioners, they could not read the Bible and they had to use visuals to learn catechism. So the church began to insist on better training and also celibacy. And that debate over priest marriage is still ongoing in the Catholic Church today. And I'm definitely not here to tell Catholic priests how to lead their sex lives. But it is interesting to note that celibacy only became the norm a full millennium after the time of Jesus. Like so many other things with religion, it's a historical development, not a scriptural requirement. So with increased revenue and prestige, the church could then go on to refashion all of society itself. A key goal of the church was to limit warfare, which remained endemic in Europe despite the feudal system. So the popes began to insist on rules for warfare. This was known as a peace of God or the truce of God. Truce, T-R-U-C-E, like a ceasefire. Essentially, the truce of God was the ancestor of the modern Geneva Convention, the notion that even war should abide by some rules. So what kind of rules are we talking about? Well, as with the modern Geneva Conventions, killing enemy combatants would be okay, but not civilians. Some weapons would be off limits too. The crossbow, that was considered too powerful because it could kill a man at a distance. So the popes thought that it should not be used, against Christians at least. It was okay with infidels. Popes also asked that war stop on important holidays like Christmas or Easter, or even every Sunday, which should be a day of rest and prayer. And Friday too, since Jesus died on that day and it was a time of mourning, not killing. And during Lent too, and important saint holidays, and on until knights complained that there was never a good day to fight according to the church, which was the whole point. Knights typically decided to fight on anyway, so the church eventually developed a clever idea. If young men were going to fight no matter what, they should fight for a good cause. Think of courtly love. Knights should not be brutes, they should be idealists. And specifically, the popes thought that the knights should fight abroad against non-Christians. That would be the Crusades, which we'll cover in the next lecture. Well, seems like a great time to stop, so let's just recap what we learned today. First, the High Middle Ages saw the development of a new social system, feudalism, based on a network of individual contracts that gave everyone a spot in society and led to greater social stability. Second, improvements in agriculture led to a population boom in the 11th century, right? And third, as Europe got richer, it could afford to shift its focus from sheer survival to culture, universities, architecture, and eventually the Crusades. We'll pick it up from here next time. In the meantime, watch Monty Python and the Holy Grail, which is a modern parody of the Arthurian legends of Romance literature, and also watch The Name of the Rose and Medieval Whodunit, with occasional discussions of Aristotle and Thomas Aquinas. Very good too. So long, au revoir.